Edward VII was not Queen Mary's son. He was her father-in-law. Edward VIII was the one who abdicated. If you've seen videos that confuse this, they got the basic facts wrong. That confusion tells you everything you need to know about the quality of research behind the accusations. So let's get this straight. Queen Victoria died in 1901. Her son became King Edward VII, and he ruled until his death on May 6, 1910. Edward VII was married to Alexandra of Denmark. Their son was George V, and George V married Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, the woman history knows as Queen Mary. She stood beside him at his coronation in 1910, not as some villainous schemer, but as his wife of 17 years and the mother of his 6 children. One of those children was born in 1894 and given the name Edward. He would become Edward VIII in January 1936. He would abdicate that same December. He was Mary's son. His grandfather, Edward VII, had been dead for 26 years by then. 26 years. A generation. The difference between a grandfather and his grandson. These aren't obscure details. This is basic British royal genealogy. And when someone builds an entire video around Mary's supposed crimes while confusing her father-in-law with her son, you're not watching history. You're watching someone who couldn't be bothered to check Wikipedia. But here's the thing. The genealogy error isn't the worst part. The worst part is the accusation that followed it. Blood on her hands. The claim that Queen Mary bears responsibility for the murder of the Romanovs in 1918, that she somehow blocked the rescue of Tsar Nicholas II and his family. This accusation requires ignoring how power actually worked in the British constitutional system. A queen consort held no constitutional office. None. She took no oath of governance, she had no legal authority to sign documents, approve legislation, or conduct diplomacy. The distinction between a queen regnant like Victoria, who inherited the throne in her own right, and a queen consort was not semantic wordplay. It was the difference between wielding sovereign power and possessing none whatsoever. Mary's role was ceremonial, domestic, and supportive. She could accompany her husband to state dinners. She could visit hospitals. She could manage the household and raise the children. What she could not do, under any interpretation of British law, was participate in cabinet meetings, correspond officially with foreign governments, or override the decisions of elected officials and her own husband. She was the king's wife, not the king. So what actually happened with the Romanovs? In March 1917, following the February Revolution, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated. He was George V's first cousin, their mothers were sisters, both daughters of King Christian IX of Denmark. The family resemblance between the two men was so striking that people confused them in photographs. Same beard, same build, same eyes staring out from formal portraits. If you've ever seen the comparison images, it's uncanny, almost like brothers. The provisional government indicated the imperial family might need to leave Russia, and the British War Cabinet discussed offering them asylum. Prime Minister David Lloyd George's government was initially receptive. The offer was extended through diplomatic channels, and then the panic set in. Picture the atmosphere in Britain in spring 1917, the war grinding on, casualties mounting, food shortages biting, the labor movement growing stronger by the month, demanding change, demanding an end to the old order that had sent millions to die in the trenches. And now, the proposal lands on the desk. Bring the deposed Tsar of all Russia to British soil. The man who had ruled as an autocrat, the symbol of everything the working classes were beginning to reject. George V's private secretary, Lord Stamfordham, began writing letters. Not on his own initiative, on the king's instructions. These weren't suggestions. They were expressions of royal anxiety, growing more urgent by the day. The letters went to the Foreign Office, warning that the presence of the Romanovs could provoke a revolutionary reaction at home. Tsarina Alexandra made it worse. She was German by birth, Princess Alex of Hesse, and anti-German sentiment in 1917 Britain was vicious. Shop windows smashed, German-sounding names changed overnight. Even the royal family felt the pressure, which is why George V made the dramatic decision in July 1917 to change the family name from the Germanic Saxe-Coburg and Gotha to the thoroughly English Windsor. One letter from Stamfordham in April 1917 explicitly states that, from the first, the king had harbored doubts about the wisdom of the offer. The crucial letters are preserved in the royal archives. Historians, including Kenneth Rose and Helen Rappaport, have examined them, pored over them, traced the timeline of the withdrawal. Queen Mary appears nowhere in this correspondence. No letters from her to government ministers, no memos bearing her signature, no diary entries suggesting she lobbied her husband either way. Nothing. The withdrawal was gradual. The invitation never formally rescinded, just allowed to drift, to fade, to become yesterday's urgent matter while today brought new crises. The Bolsheviks seized power in November 1917. The window slammed shut. On the night of July 17, 1918, the Romanov family was executed in a basement in Ekaterinburg. Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children. All of them. The accusation that Mary bears responsibility requires inventing a role for her that never existed. She didn't have the power. She couldn't have had it. A queen consort in 1917 Britain had about as much influence over asylum decisions as you or I do today. But wait, there's another accusation. The cruel mother who hid her sick child away and felt only relief when he died. Prince John Charles Francis was born on July 12, 1905, the youngest of Mary's 6 children. For his first few years, he seemed to develop like his siblings. Then, around 1909, when he was 4 years old, something changed. The seizures began. Here's what you need to understand about 1909. Phenobarbital, the first effective anticonvulsant, wasn't introduced until 1912. Even then, it had limited effectiveness for many patients. Surgical interventions for epilepsy didn't exist. There was no MRI to map the brain, no specialists with decades of research behind them. There was watching, waiting, hoping the next seizure wouldn't come. The next seizure always came. John's condition was what modern medicine would call refractory epilepsy seizures that don't respond to medication. They were uncontrollable, unpredictable, and grew worse as he aged. He also showed signs of developmental delays, possibly autism spectrum disorder in modern terms, though such diagnoses didn't exist in his era. His behavior could be unpredictable. His communication was difficult. His needs were complex in ways that the early 20th century had no framework to address. Mary watched this. For years, she watched this. The convulsions that came without warning, the aftermath, the confusion, the exhaustion, the slow recovery before the next one hit. The gradual realization that it wasn't getting better, that it was never going to get better, that medicine had nothing to offer. In 1917, John was moved to Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate. This gets framed as hidden away. But let's be precise about what Wood Farm actually was. It sat less than 2 miles from the main house where the royal family stayed when in residence at Sandringham. Not a distant asylum, not a faraway institution, a nearby property, quiet, removed from the chaos of royal public life, the constant visitors, the formal dinners, the unpredictable demands that could trigger seizures in a child whose nervous system could bear no additional strain. John was placed under the care of his nanny, Charlotte Lala Bill, who had been with him since infancy. Lala loved him. That's documented. She had devoted herself to his care for years, knew his patterns, understood his needs in ways that no one else could. Mary visited John regularly when at Sandringham. Letters from the period show her inquiring about his health with evident maternal concern. She asked after him. She worried about him. She watched him decline. Unless you've lived alongside someone with refractory epilepsy, unless you've witnessed what uncontrolled seizures do to a developing mind and body over years, unless you've sat helpless while someone you love suffers in ways you cannot ease, you're not equipped to judge the decisions made by those who cared for him. John died on January 18, 1919, following a severe seizure. He was 13 years old. When Mary wrote that his death was a release, she was expressing something that any parent who has watched a child suffer from an uncontrollable illness will recognize. Not coldness, not relief that a burden was lifted. The grief-stricken acknowledgement that death ended suffering that medicine couldn't touch. That her boy was finally at peace. This isn't the statement of a woman who didn't love her son. It's the statement of a woman who had watched her child convulse and deteriorate for a decade without any power to help. Mary buried her first child that cold January of 1919. The family closed ranks around a grief too private for public consumption. She would bury two more. Her fourth son, Prince George, Duke of Kent, served in the Royal Air Force during World War II. He was 39 years old, married to Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, father of 3 children. The youngest, Prince Michael of Kent, was 7 weeks old, a baby who would never know his father. On August 25, 1942, the Sunderland flying boat carrying Prince George to Iceland flew into a hillside in Caithness, Scotland, near the village of Dunbeath. Poor weather, sudden impact. 14 of 15 people aboard died. Mary was 75 when that telegram arrived at Badminton House, where she had evacuated during the war. 75 years old, and now she had buried 2 children. One to illness that medicine couldn't treat, one to a hillside in Scotland, his aircraft broken apart, his body recovered from the wreckage. And then there was George VI, the son who never expected to be king. The son with the stammer, the quiet disposition, the preference for family life over public spectacle. The son who stepped up when his older brother chose Wallace Simpson over the crown, and who led Britain through 6 years of war with a dignity that cost him everything. The strain broke his health. He underwent surgery for lung cancer in September 1951. On February 6, 1952, King George VI died in his sleep at Sandringham House from a coronary thrombosis. 56 years old. Mary learned of her son's death while in London. She was 84. She had now buried 3 of her 6 children, John at 13, George at 39, George VI at 56. 3 different kinds of loss. The infant vulnerability of John's illness, the sudden violence of George's wartime death, the slow decline of George VI's broken health. And through it all, through all of this, the abdication crisis. December 11, 1936, Edward VIII standing before microphones, his voice crackling across the radio waves, announcing that he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and discharge his duties as king without the help and support of the woman he loved. Mary had begged him to do his duty. She had watched him carry on with Wallace Simpson, an American woman who had divorced one husband and was divorcing another. And she had implored him to understand that the crown was not a prize to be claimed or discarded at will. It was a sacred trust. Personal happiness yielded to public obligation. That was the bargain. That was always the bargain. Edward didn't listen. Mary transferred her support immediately and completely to her second son, the new King George VI. She appeared at his coronation in May 1937, the first Dowager Queen to attend the crowning of her successor, breaking centuries of precedent to signal that the family stood united despite the scandal. But the worst was yet to come. In October 1937, less than a year after leaving the throne, the Duke of Windsor and his new wife visited Nazi Germany as personal guests of Adolf Hitler. Personal guests. The trip was pure propaganda, and it succeeded beyond Nazi hopes. Edward and Wallace toured German factories, inspecting the machinery of the Reich with evident interest. They met Nazi officials who photographed every handshake. On October 22, 1937, they visited Hitler himself at his mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden, the Führer's private sanctuary in the Bavarian Alps. Edward gave the Nazi salute on multiple occasions during the trip. Not reluctantly, not under pressure. He raised his arm willingly. He expressed admiration for what the German regime had accomplished. The photographs went worldwide. For Mary, watching from England, this was mortification beyond embarrassment. Something closer to betrayal. Her son, the man who had been King Emperor of the British Empire less than a year before, was consorting with a regime that stood against everything Britain represented, everything she had spent her life upholding. The documents known as the Windsor File, captured by Allied forces at the end of the war, revealed the extent of Nazi interest in Edward. German officials discussed the possibility of installing him as a puppet king of Britain if the invasion succeeded. Whether Edward would have cooperated remains debated by historians, but the mere fact that the Nazis considered him a useful tool speaks to how far he had fallen from the standards his mother embodied. And some viral videos don't mention this at all. Curious omission, that. Mary refused to receive Wallis Simpson for the rest of her life. She would not grant her the title of Royal Highness. Some have called this snobbery. But look at the full picture. Look at the Nazi salutes in Germany. Look at the propaganda photographs distributed worldwide. Look at the Windsor File. Mary saw in Wallis not just an unsuitable match, but a woman who had enabled her son's degradation. Queen Mary died on March 24, 1953, at Marlborough House in London. She was 85 years old. She missed her granddaughter Elizabeth's coronation by 10 weeks. In her final year, she had devoted herself to preparing Elizabeth for the role that fate had thrust upon her. She corresponded with her regularly, advised her on protocol and history, shared the accumulated wisdom of decades as queen consort and queen mother. Mary saw in Elizabeth the qualities the monarchy would need: intelligence, dignity, and an unshakable commitment to duty. The qualities Mary herself had embodied for half a century. She had buried 3 of her 6 children. She had watched one disgrace himself with Nazis. She had held the monarchy together through an abdication crisis that could have destroyed it. She had no blood on her hands regarding the Romanovs. She didn't have that power. Couldn't have had it. And the correspondence proves she wasn't involved. The accusations against her say more about sloppy research than about her character. She wasn't a villain. She was a woman who endured repeated tragedies while maintaining the dignity that the crown required. She visited hospitals during both world wars, not for the photographs, but long after the cameras had gone, asking questions, listening to answers, remembering names. She supported her husband through 25 years of reign. She transferred her loyalty to George VI without hesitation when Edward failed. She prepared Elizabeth for the role that history demanded. The next time you see a video claiming Queen Mary had blood on her hands, or that she cruelly abandoned her sick child, ask yourself one simple question. Did they even get the Edwards right? If they confused Edward VII with Edward VIII, if they couldn't distinguish a grandfather from his grandson, couldn't separate 1910 from 1936, they can't be trusted on the harder questions. Mary deserved better than viral misinformation. History owes her accuracy. Subscribe for more stories like this.